Okay, here's a really simple program where I have an array you can see right here called hours, which is going to hold 6 integers. I have an integer variable called count, and we're going to ask the user to enter the hours worked by 6 employees. So this is just going to use a for loop, and you'll see here count is just really going to be my index. It's going to start at 0. It's going to continue while it's less than the number of employees, which is 6. So it's going to start at 0. It's going to continue while it's less than 6. So it's going to go through 6 times, and it's going to read these user entered values first into hour sub 0, then hour sub 1, then hour sub 2, etc., etc. And then last, it's going to use a for loop to display the contents of the array. So I'll run this and show it to you. So over here, I'm just going to, I'll just enter, I don't know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. And then it displays the hours entered. All right, so that works fine, but it's somewhat limited. The user has to enter all the data. It only works for exactly 6 things. So what might be more flexible in this situation is to create an input file that we have the data in and get this same code to work for data in an input file, and not just for 6 hours, but for any number of employee hours that are actually stored in the input file. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to create a new file. So I'm going to say add file, and I'm going to call it employee hours, and I'm going to make that a text file. And in here, I'm just going to enter in the same data that I entered in as the user just to get started. Now, I'll put in 10. Now, it just has, the data has to be separated by a white space character, right? Like a tab, a space, an enter key. So I can type it 10, 20, 30 like this, or I could put each entry on a separate line. That's fine. Okay. You want to make sure, don't hit the enter key. You don't want to have a blank line. You can tell I've got a blank line because you can see line number 7 has nothing on it, because this is going to put an end of line character in your file, and that's going to cause problems. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go back to my main program, and I'm going to create an input file stream, and I'm going to associate it with this input file. So I have to include the fstream library. And here I'll create an input file stream. And I'm going to call that, I'm going to just call that input file. That's going to be the name of my input file stream. So now I need to associate that using our open function with the name of the file that we just created. Let's see here. So make sure I put an S at the end of that. Okay, I did. All right. Anytime you have an input file, it is always a good idea to check to make sure that it was opened properly. And if it's not opened properly, you should provide an error message, because you don't want the program to go on anymore if the input file is not found. Okay, so here I just added some code. If this does not find the input file, then I'll get an error message. It says I cannot find your input file, and my program will exit. -1 just means it's not a normal termination to the program, but exit leaves the program. You don't want to continue any further down. So that will just check that. All right. Now, we don't have to ask the user anymore to input the hours because we're going to be reading them from our file. So I'll just take that prompt for the user out. Now, we know right now that there's 6 things in the file, but our goal is to have you know, as many things as we want in there. We could have 3, we could have 6, we could have 100. So I really don't want to use a for loop, because a for loop is kind of for when you know how many things there are. So we're going to use a while loop, and we're going to check for when we reach the end of file. So I'm going to say while, and here's where I'm going to check. Okay, so while not input file.eof, that's looking for the end of file, right? So while it's not the end of file, I'm going to read something in, store it in the array, and then I'm going to move on to the next step. So in our for loop, we had this little counter here, which started at 0. So I'm still going to use that. It's going to be a counter, but it's also going to be an index. So I want it to start at 0. And what I'm going to do, instead of where we have a cin statement, right, because cin means it's coming from the keyboard, what we're going to do is we're going to read that information in from our input file. And right now count is 0, so that's good. It'll read it into hour sub 0, but we need to increment the counter, so the next time through it'll read it into count sub 1 and then count sub 2, and etc., etc. So we don't need our for loop anymore. All right, and here this should just display, you know, how many, you know, this should display everything back out. Okay, so let's run this. We'll take a look at it. And it says the hours you entered are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. All right, so now when I come down here, this loop is going through 6 times. So if I come into my input file and I add, you know, some more, let's say I add 15, 25, 35, for instance, and I go back to my main program and I run it, okay, so this gives us a problem, and you can see it is displaying the number of hours, but only up to the 60 that I put in initially. So if I look back at my main program, the real problem is that I have my array only holding 6 elements. So that's where I'm getting the error message from. So I'm going to increment the size of my array, or increase it, I should say. And let's make that 25. Okay. And now let's see what happens when we run it. Right, so we get all of the numbers, but then we get some garbage values as well. So the problem is when we come down here, this loop is going through all 25 elements, and we don't have 25 elements. Right now, if we look over here, we have 9. Okay, so this counter is actually keeping track of how many things are being put in the array. So when I finish this while loop, right, my counter is going to hold the number of elements in the array. So I'm going to come down here to my for loop, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just change here. Sorry, I'm going to change, I don't want to use my counter for loop. Okay, sorry. I'm just going to change my loop control variable that counts everything. I don't want to call it count anymore because count's holding the number of elements. So I'm just going to change it. I'll just give it a name, I, and I'll use that instead in this particular loop. Okay. All right. So now this loop is going to go through. If you look at it, we have a counter counting how many things are in here, right? Every time through the loop it gets incremented. And now my for loop that displays is going to go through exactly that many times. So let's run this and see what it looks like. Okay, and now you can see it displays all the values that are in the input file. So this code here is much more flexible. It's going to read until it reaches the end of the input file, right, by using this test for the end of the input file. We're going to have a counter that's going to count the number of items that are in the input file, because that's important to us. And then we're going to use that counter later on in our program to determine how many things are in the file, in this case, in order to display. So you just have to be careful really in here. You don't want to leave, if you have any extra lines out here, that might read in those end of line characters depending on the data type you're using, and it can do some, odd things. Let's see what happens here. Right, you'll see at the end of the input file, I get, some crazy numbers coming out. So just make sure, oops, there we go, that you're when you are done with your file, right, when it's being saved here, that your cursor is right here. That leaves the end of file marker right there after the last piece of data, and that's really important. So you make sure you have sufficient room for however many elements are going to be in your input file, right? We learned that the hard way. Make sure you initialize your counter to 0, right? Because it's got to increment as you're putting things in. You have to open your file. Always check to make sure that your file was open properly. And then here you can see, right, we're using a while loop, testing for the end of file marker to read this data in from our file and incrementing our counter. And once we know what this value is, we know how many things are in our file, we can use that later on in a for loop to display the contents. And I just want to show you quick here, right? If I put in the wrong file name, for instance, and I run this, see, I cannot find your input file. So that will give you an error message. And that's just really important, because if it can't find your input file, you need to know if the problem is with your code or the problem is just not finding your input file. So this is a really important error check to have in there.